Firstly, thank you to the organisers for inviting me to come to India. It's always a great pleasure for me to come here. That trained as I am in a Western mindset and trained as a scientist, I found almost by accident that my own thought in the area of consciousness studies was taking me in an Eastern direction. So it's always fascinating to come here and to interchange with people who have a kind of universal perspective and are trying to, in a way, relate that universal perspective to the particulars, whereas I'm trained in a way to start off with a particular and maybe at the end of a long chain of reasoning get to something universal. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of that with you today. The last talk was looking at the self from the inside and the outside. I'm going to be looking at the self ultimately in terms of the relationship between the conscious self and the unconscious self. And as I say, I'm going to creep up on the self, as opposed to most of the other talks which have started with a deep conception of the self and then try to expand it in different ways. I'm going to start with something very specific and hopefully in the end arrive at some conclusions about one aspect of the self which maybe touches on the more universal. And the topic I'm going to pick, and there are many topics I could have picked, is the topic of free will and how the self engages in exercising free will. Let's see how this works. I'm going to draw on fragments of my book, Understanding Consciousness. So I'm just going to present a tiny little fragment of a general system of thought which takes many particulars, but ultimately converges on hopefully something of a universal theme. And some of what I'm going to say to you, you'll find easy to understand, but I'm sure at the end of my half hour, which is very brief for something as major as this, you're going to have a lot of deep questions, and I'm going to have to skip over all sorts of things, and I hope you're really going to come back and ask some penetrating questions so we can expand on some of the things which I'm sure I won't be able to convey to you in any depth. So, to pick the specific thing that I'm going to focus on, I'm going to ask what's the source of our conscious wishes and also what's the source of the decisions we make in response to those wishes, and do we have a part of ourselves that actually is responsible, so to speak, for carrying out voluntary acts? And that hopefully will tell us a little bit about the nature of the self. Now, you've already heard, as I said, many different ways of partialing up the self, social self. You can do it cognitively, you can do it developmentally, and so on. But I'm going to really look at some very specific ways in which we operate and ask the question of which bit of me is conscious and which bit of me is unconscious with respect to this particular kind of operation. And one of the reasons I find this topic worthy of at least presenting to you of all the many topics I might have picked is that it's so important, not just philosophically. We had a very nice paper on the free will, for example, on the first day, where we have this, if you like, immediate, if you like, conflict, intuitive conflict between our feelings of freedom, the feelings that we can choose and that we're responsible for the choices that we make, and determinism, which is, if you like, the world picture which is being presented to us by science and how the brain is operating. So this isn't just a philosophical problem, it's also a social problem, it's a legal problem, it's an ethical problem. And so, I'd like to spend a bit of time with this because it has practical consequences as well as theoretical interest. Now, where I want to start with this is to actually just talk a little bit about what I mean by free will. Well, and following an approach which I think hopefully will be appealing to most of you, I'm very much going to follow how I feel my freedom. So it's fundamentally a phenomenological point of departure. And the first thing I want to say, for those of you who are familiar with, and many of you will be, with the free will versus determinism debate, is I personally have no interest in defending what philosophers sometimes call contra-causal free will, a kind of freedom which is entirely outside of the chain of causation. And the reason I don't have any particular interest in this is because I don't feel free in that way. So when I exercise my freedom, for example, it doesn't occur to me that I can somehow contravene the laws of physics. It doesn't even occur to me in a social situation in which I'm required to maybe exercise very, very refined choices, that I'm completely free of social restraints or constraints, nor do I feel free of the law, or do I feel free of, if you like, internal ethical constraints and so on. So the kind of freedom that I'm interested in exploring and maybe making sense of is what I would call a constrained free will. It's a kind of exercise of a degree of freedom within, if you like, a network of causalities and constraints. And the question is, do I have any, or is it entirely determined? So that's one of the reasons modern science has made this even more difficult. So insofar as this has been a study, and it is now a topic in consciousness studies, the notion that, if you like, the brain makes up his mind, and then our feeling of freedom follows what the brain has already decided, has become a very major issue in consciousness studies research. And it was made famous by the work of Benjamin Libet. Now, what he did, I'm only going to talk about this very roughly, just to give you an idea, because I don't want to get into the technological details, but you may wish to explore those or not later on, is he was interested in the feeling of freedom, and this very, very small feeling of freedom, that is associated with doing something very simple, like flexing your wrist, just like that. And it had already been known for quite a while, when he got interested in this area, that the brain, not surprisingly, readies itself to carry out a voluntary act. It has to prepare the musculature and so on. And that can take place maybe about, up to a second, but in the paradigms that he was working with, usually about half a second before people actually did something like that. And so I had a simple experiment in which there was a time frame in which people were free to choose to do that at some time within this time frame, but it was up to them when to choose. And what was known, as I say beforehand, is that there was a marker in the brain, what's called an evoked potential, a slow-going negative potential that you could actually see arising about maybe half a second before people actually did that. But he wanted to ask a different question, which is, what's the relationship of what the brain is doing to when the decision, the conscious decision to do that arises? And he had a particular methodology of working that out, and he found, contrary to natural intuition, that it wasn't the case that the conscious decision to do that arises first, then the brain readies itself to do it, and then you do it. Rather, the evoked potential arises at point T1. About 350 milliseconds after that, the conscious decision to do that happens, and then about 150 milliseconds after that, you actually move your hand. Now, that's deeply troubling for this whole panoply of ethical issues, and could be taken to have very strongly deterministic implications. And Libet himself was aware of that, and also wanted to, if you like, save free will, or give a role for free will. And he pointed out that although, if you like, these wishes, had arisen out of the unconscious, so to speak, or from the brain, and led to, if you like, a wish to do that, Nevertheless, once the wish had arisen, you still had 150 milliseconds in which to decide not to do it. And so he argued that what we have is free won't. We don't have free will. So it's a little bit like a Freudian wish or desire arises from the unconscious, but then the conscious ego, assisted and aided by the superego, can stop ourselves and exercise some sort of control. The only problem with that is that conceptually, if it's the case that the wish, the conscious wish, spontaneously arises, so to speak, or seemingly spontaneously arises out of the unconscious mind, why doesn't the conscious decision to carry out the wish or not also not arise from the unconscious? And so there was this debate, within the field. And in fact, one of my research students actually carried out a PhD thesis looking at whether there were pre-conscious triggers for a decision not to do something as well as a pre-conscious decision to do something. And without going into the details, because I'm mindful of the limit of time, indeed you could show that there were pre-conscious ways of triggering an inhibition response as well as a do something response. So what we've done is deepen the problem so far. We haven't addressed it in any way. Now, you might think that this is very counterintuitive, and that free will, the notion that the brain, or if you like, let me call it the brain, mind, or self for the moment. Let me be open. Let me leave this question of what it is that prepares a conscious wish entirely a question to be investigated further down the line. But to begin with, of course, it's the evidence is produced by neuropsychological research. And as I say, this is in complete conflict, so one might think, with natural intuitions, that we think that it's a conscious wish that actually initiates the whole of a voluntary act. But if you actually look at what we think of as cognitive processing in human acts, that actually this particular relationship of the experience to the processes which enable the experience to be carried out is not unique to free will. So, if you... goodness. is that genuinely half an hour? How long was that? Was that 20 minutes? Are you sure you didn't start me late? All right, let me carry on. There's a terrible... I need a 1.5 hour talk here, but I will tell you something which hopefully is meaningful to you in the remaining minutes. So I'm talking to you, and within psychology, speech production is a paradigm example of a complex motor task which can only be carried out with conscious control. But we've studied speech production in great depth, and if you think about it as a system, what kind of system of mind, what kind of mental processes must be involved in speech production, then I must have had an idea stored somewhere in my mind or brain. That idea would have had to be formulated into English language sentences. That requires that I have a knowledge of English syntax. Somehow or other, I've selected from all the words I know which words I'm going to use in this particular case, and fitted that into a grammatical structure. Then, all these activities in my central nervous system have to travel down to make these articulators move. And then in about 1 minute of discourse, something like 10 to 15,000 neuromuscular events occur. And I ask myself, how conscious was all that? And the truth is I'm conscious of hearing my voice, I'm conscious of seeing you in the room, I'm conscious of waving my hands. And literally it is the case that I'm only conscious of what I want to say. I've only realized what I want to say once I've actually spoken. So the actual experience follows the processing to which it most obviously relates. The same applies to reading. If you read this quickly internally, and do that quickly, and you'll realize that well, if you're like me, something like an internal inner speech will have come to your mind, like, if we don't increase the dustmen's wages, they will refuse to take the refuse. Yeah? And what you won't have noticed is that one word appears twice. That word and that word. So the same visual pattern was internally experienced as refuse to be in the first case, and as refuse in the second case. At the point it entered your conscious experience, how did you know how to allocate the stress patterns? The only way you could have known is if you'd already analyzed the meaning of the sentence, worked out that one was a noun, one was a verb, and that one has one stress pattern and the other one had another stress pattern, and that was what actually appeared into consciousness. And the same applies to thinking. If you just think, have you followed what I've said so far, and just note what comes to mind. Doesn't matter what it is. Just note what comes to mind. And then think, for that to have come into mind, what kind of complex processes of assessment must have taken place where you understood what I said or didn't understand what I said related to what you already knew, and then made a kind of global assessment of to the extent to what I'm saying fits in with what you already understand. And so the end product, even thoughts arise, if you like, from vastly complex processes which are in the unconscious mind. So then I can say, well, who's doing all this? Am I just the conscious bit of me, which is the bit I normally associate myself with? Or is this unconscious bit of me sitting on a vast unconscious structure, the results of which are appearing in consciousness? And what I want to say, and I'm really cutting this short, is that what follows from this line of reasoning is that what changes when something enters into conscious experience is that I realize what I think. In becoming conscious, it becomes subjectively real to me. And so we have this kind of global model emerging of, if you like, an unconscious sea of processes, which you can think of in many different ways. And as these emerge into conscious experience, they become subjectively real, in other words, realized. And we get back to this famous iceberg metaphor, which was mentioned in the last talk, but which now extends in this way of talking. So typically in Freud's iceberg, just the tip of the iceberg represents the conscious self, and the rest of the iceberg represents the personal unconscious and so on. But in this particular picture, what's also there is that the unconscious part, the base of the iceberg, sits in and is supported by and is actually an emanation of the surrounding sea. And so there is a sense in which you can think of the process of becoming aware of things as more of those unconscious contents arising into consciousness and becoming realized. And coming back to the problem of free will, just to give a kind of circularity to the talk, the problem that we have in trying to understand some of these findings, and many others which I could talk about at length, is that we confuse the conscious feeling of volition with all the rest of me that's actually involved in making the decision, the choices, and so on. Although it might be an illusion to think of one's conscious self as, or the conscious feeling of self as being, and by this I mean phenomenal consciousness, as being in control, the notion that my conscious phenomenal self, if you like, is just the surface tip of this rather large edifice, which is also me, is the part that then exercises free will. Now, what I haven't done with you, unfortunately, which I can do with you, is to show you how this way of looking at things allows a compatibilism between determinism and free will. So if one of you, wants to ask me that question, which is clearly something I haven't answered in question time, I'd be delighted to then go into that. But I need to give you time to ask questions, and I'm sorry I haven't had enough time to do this in serious depth with you. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. All right. Thank you for raising a very important question, lies at the heart of the distinction between humanities and natural sciences. I'm reversing the gaze. Initially, I was trained in experimental psychology within the natural science mode, and I was appointed at the job at one time or as a rat runner.
As a what?
Rat runner. I was to run the rats.
Yeah, rat runner.
You have to understand this.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, of course.
Yeah, I was in control as a scientist, and I was controlling the rat. Of course, I realized that rat has its own mind, but that's another point. Okay, the point is that in spite of this deterministic framework, an expression sneaks in the description that at each choice point in the maze, the rat has a choice between the two. Otherwise, why would you put him in a maze? So in other words, the rat has freedom of choice, not me, the scientist. This is one. Okay. The second is, if from Bacon on, science is supposed to be in control, for what? For the best of humanity, for the enhancement of the estate of man, as Francis Bacon put it. If a scientist sells himself saying that Pasteur and others have done a great job for the universe, so let us practice this so that we can give these kinds of things to humanity, then I have a problem, because a control without choice is meaningless and nonsense. A scientist without being able to choose between good and bad is absolute nonsense. Okay, so this is my reversing the gaze on science. As a humanities person, me without choice, in an ethical sense, makes me non-human. I can't accept that. So
Sure.
This is the dilemma.
Sure. Let me take that as a little bit of a cue to start talking about this other problem, which I hadn't actually got round to talking about, which is how even do you begin to square, if you like, our freedoms of freedom with a form of scientific determinism. And the first thing I want to say about it, first of all, I should say I think it's perfectly possible to do. The compatibilism is possible, but you have to have a different understanding of the kind of system of mind that we actually have. Quantum mechanics doesn't help very much in this, and a typical cognitive psychologist simply wouldn't go in that direction. So for a cognitive psychologist, even to begin to think of what kind of creatures are human beings, or what kind of system is the human brain, or what kind of system is the human mind, you have to build in enormous complexity of a very particular kind. So you have to say, look, let's say we're building an android, which would act just like a human being. What would we have to put into it? First thing you'd have to build into it is a knowledge base. So that system would have to understand the external world. In order to operate as we do, it would also have to understand the social world. It would also have to have a sense of how it's located, how we are located in this social and physical world. You would have to give it a motivational structure. It would have to have something equivalent to needs, desires, goals, and so on. You would have to build into it strategies for fulfilling those goals. You'd have to build into it ways of simulating, possible outcomes if it followed certain strategies in order that it maximized its possible use of the best possible strategy. You'd have to build into it ways of correcting itself as it went along. You'd have to build into it the ability to learn from experience. It would have to be relatively autonomous. And so you're now talking about a very complex system able to, this is as a cognitive psychologist would build one, able to exercise choice according to its understanding of the external and internal situation in the light of its inner needs and goals. And that would already be a system that has degrees of freedom to act according to its own being, so to speak. And all that would be within the chain of causality. It's not outside of causality, but it's a very complex formulation of causality. And if you'd left something out, so you could say, well, human beings could flip a coin, you'd have to build that in as well into the machine. Or if you think, well, it could be irrational, it could be emotional, let's put that in as well. And then you are starting to get a sense of what kind of mind, we have viewed properly in terms of human information processing and from a third-person perspective. And that would be consistent with the feeling that I have that in very specific situations, it's up to me to make decisions according to, my inner needs, the external contingencies, the ethics of the community I'm working within, the likely consequences of my output, of my behavior and so on, and to take the consequences of those choices. And so it's perfectly possible to devise a form of understanding, if you like, of a scientific kind, of mental processes, which is completely consistent with our feelings of free will.
Okay.
I'm glad I got that out.
Brief comment. Brief comment and a brief question. Probably following on. The comment is that I think this issue is really excellent for bringing together the 3 days of the meeting, because you have the extremely important phenomenology of free will, as we discussed today. Then there's also a specific biology, so we know the pre-supplementary motor area. If you stimulate there, you have an experience of will. That happens. And also there's this important distinction between the experience of free will and assuming that free will is somehow ontologically real and needs to be injected into a physical system somehow in between stochasticity and determinism, or by some extra physical cause and the like. And I think very much sympathetic to your line, that it's really not a problem at all, and that even within well-understood causal chains, and this is the question now, so I quite like the way Mike Shadlin and Patrick Haggard put it, in many of our actions there's a certain freedom from immediacy, and this can be a very adaptive freedom from immediacy, whether it's just exploratory behavior or long-range goal-directed behavior. It pays organisms not always to be influenced by their immediate sensory motor surroundings. And so it seems then reasonable that freedom from immediacy should be accompanied by specific sorts of phenomenal contents to mark it out from other sorts of actions. And do you think that's like a reasonable way to explain why we have a particular kind of phenomenal experience going along with free will that has particular adaptive consequences? And indeed, could that vary in a cross-cultural way? Because obviously, and you alluded to this with your social constraints, we're not all equally free from immediacy.
No, I think that's a nice inroad into the whole issue. But given that we're in India, I want to extend it in a slightly different way as well, which is that a part of what arises into conscious experience as a consequence of carrying out certain acts is an evaluation of that experience. It's part of the natural givens in conscious experience. We call it the conscious periphery. And so every act of conscious experience is associated with a kind of judgment, which also simply arises. Now, that judgment arises, if you like, from the depths of one's own being. And I personally and I simply haven't got time even to dip my toe into this water, leave open the question of what is the fullness of my own being. And if, for example, one acts, shall we say, instrumentally, as you describe it, in a particular case, so you're maybe not locked into the immediacy of the situation, you can delay gratification and all that stuff, and all terms that you would find, very, if you like, consonant with the Darwinian framework and so on. But you go on and do that, and then at the end of the day, you kind of just feel it wasn't right. There's kind of deeper feeling that arises, a deeper judgment. Then I would say that we still have to be open about where the sources of those deeper feelings come from. What happens, in the typical midlife crisis, for example, when you as one, very sage lady who was once one of my teachers said, you climb up a ladder, you get to the top only to realize that it's leaning against the wrong wall. Where does that feeling come from? And so, I'm opening up to the possibility that we have these depths, if you like, which are the ultimate drivers, which also are part of our learning process of being embodied in the world and so on. And that, once one goes in this direction, you get into much more of a proper engagement of, if you like, our typical Western concerns with the dominant drivers that one finds in the East.
Hi, Professor Velmans. Your talk addressed the existential nature of free will, existential question whether there is free will or determinism and so on. In several works of fiction and also in psychiatric illnesses, the narrative voice, for example, most famously in Kafka's The Burrow, the narrative voice shifts from first person to third person when under duress or under extreme trauma, right? So my question is there a utilitarian aspect to free will? That is free will, especially when, as shown by these works of fiction, where even in mid-sentence people shift from first person to third person, is there utilitarian and an adaptive and an evolutionary aspect to free will? And is that a good line of inquiry to go into, rather than just existential, And I also think a utilitarian approach to free will also help, the compatibilism enterprise. So I want your thoughts and perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a complex question because whether it's adaptive to switch in one's conversation from a first person to a third person approach, it might be. But the thing that I would want to draw attention to, which is more primary than that, is that we do this habitually, whether we're, if you like, in environmentally challenging situations or not, and don't notice that we're doing it. And part of the reason we do it habitually is because, all right, this is going to be very quick, but there's a whole other hour here, that simply because we are in different bodies, we necessarily have a first-person approach to our whole field of conscious experience, in the tradition of European phenomenology, if you like. So all this that I see is part of my experience in a way. So I can talk about it in terms of how I experience it, typically first person. But if I'm talking about somebody else's mind, for example, I can't access their experience. So I can only talk about their mind or their brain from a third-person perspective. And within psychology, we typically switch from one to the other when we want to know, something about how something looks when viewed from the outside, how it's experienced, as a psychologist, I do this all the time, from the point of view of the subject. And it's quite natural in all sorts of situations to switch from one perspective to the other. So if, for example, I'm studying visual perception, I'd start off with, a stimulus that I can observe in the world, trace through all the events in a subject's visual system, all the things going on in their brains. But, of course, that doesn't tell me anything about whether they can see the stimulus I've presented or not. I have to ask them. So I switch from my third-person perspective to their first-person perspective, if I'm doing it the other way around, I might go to the doctor and say, doctor, I've, got this ache in my stomach, or whatever, and he says, oh, that's very interesting from your third-person perspective. Let's see if you've got an ulcer. So he switches from my first-person perspective to his third-person perspective, and this is really important in the end. Because one thing I haven't talked about, which is another topic of great interest to me, is how do you make sense of the causal interactions between consciousness and brain? And one of the ways that starts to kind of lay open the problem is by noticing just these perspectival switches. I can't do that with you, because I haven't got time. I need at least 5 minutes. I'm sure I haven't got it. The issue is important, but I'd want to expand it in a different way.
Brief. I think that free will and determination go very closely together. For example, if I'm standing here to ask this question, there's so many things determining this thing, like the way you deliver the talk, and the way I perceived it, the nature of mind and the surrounding, everything. And I also got the free will to respond in a particular way. I can ask this question or that question. So moment to moment, it is very closely entangled. And my question is, can I say that for a person who lives in the present moment with the awareness, for that person, the whole life is a life of free will. And for a person who lives either in past or in future, because lack of awareness, for him, the whole life is a life of determinism.
Yeah, it's a deep question, and some would say that the freedom that accompanies a complete immersion in the moment is a freedom to simply follow the flow of the universal principles which...
He will meet you later.
Okay. So it's a freedom of attunement.
Yeah.
That would be one take on that way of.
Well, thank you very much for a lecture on a most stimulating topic. I have just one question to ask you. What are the insights that we can get into this process of claims to free will versus claims to determinism from psychopathology? For example, in the obsessive compulsive disorder, the person is sort of aware that certain intrusive thoughts are coming and is repeatedly performing an act which does not serve a useful purpose. So he has that insight. He wants to stop it, but is unable to. Okay, and but the further analysis is that suppose you treat him with the SSRI drugs, often let's say the symptoms remit. So we can conclude that it's like the brain neurophysiology, serotonergic system that is at problem. But then it also responds to something like mindfulness-based cognitive behavior therapy and so on. So what does this indicate about the relationship between the interaction between the brain and the mind, and which is causally prior, or is it possible that in altered states of mind, like in the mindfulness meditation, actually I've tried it, I can actually observe thoughts coming and it doesn't affect me, which means that there is some I which is more fundamental than these thoughts which arise on the surface. So this raises certain interesting questions about the structure of the mind or the consciousness itself.
Absolutely. And again, it takes an hour, to unravel. But I don't want to just escape from the question. So trying to think of just a few sentences. Can't do it in less than 5 minutes. First of all, I completely accept the cases that were raised, that clearly something is malfunctioning in those situations, in many situations, in what you might call the normal operation of mental processes, and therefore the possibility of maybe taking responsibility for one's acts and so on, and really, socially and legally, that often comes up in courts, and basically the choice for a court has to be, is some form of therapy appropriate in this case, or some form of constraint appropriate in this sort of case, and that has a lot to do with practical issues, like if you're trying to rehabilitate people and so on. That's one level of answer, but in terms of understanding these different levels of mental, if you like, intervention as well as physical intervention, what I suggest you do is you have a look at chapter 14 of my book, Understanding Consciousness, or if you can't afford to do this, then there is an online paper, I'll just finish this, online paper on how could conscious experiences affect brains, which you can just, put into Google, it'll download, and you'll get some of the basic ideas which allow you to actually unravel the complexities of the question that was being asked. Thank you for your attention.
Last question.
Sorry, I thought he was ringing the final bell and I had to go.
I know I'm between lunch and everybody, but one comment and a question. Somehow I felt in your explanation with the Android example, you actually punted the question about free will versus determinism. But in the desire to seek compatibility, I have a feeling you just avoided the question, didn't answer it. The second, a question I have is...
What did I avoid?
Since there's no time, I will...
No, okay. We'll talk about it. Yeah.
The question I have, which might illustrate why I'm saying this is, do you believe that Android, which if built blah, 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 can claim to have free will?
Well, this is chapter 5.
I've been reading your books, I know.
And it has to do with whether, once you build the Android, it is actually conscious or not, and therefore can make claims of the kinds that have a meaningfulness that we make when we want to make those claims. And that's another interesting and it can't be done in a single sentence. So I'm not evading it, because I'd love to, if you give me another half hour, I'll do it. But I can't, so I can't address it. Yeah. But very happy to discuss it afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Velmans and Professor Sanyal for your excellent presentation, as well as good discussions on the topic. I will not take much time. Lunch is on the corner. I know that. My concern, and looking into the focus theme of this conference, attracted me here. Within. That's the major title that you have in all your brochure, etc. What it takes to look within. What is the methodology? Methodology in the inverted comma to go within. One that we have all along followed from the time of Carl Lashley in the 1930s, who did operations on the rat's brain, while learning the maze, and found out that even if you go on removing the brain, it has no effect. So don't look for the brain to house the mind, because brain has no equipotential. Any part of the brain can take up any of the mental function. In fact, for nearly 30 years, his researchers have almost stopped looking into the place for the mind in the brain. Again, in the 50s, thanks to Penfield, but that was not the forceful voice at that time. Although he first used the word consciousness, whether psychologists use or not, he gets a hoot for that. He said, I can't explain anything, this other than consciousness. This Second World War, when the patients came to the doctors with a gunshot wound to a particular region, let's say temporal lobe, there was a permanent memory loss. If Lashley was right, some other portions of the brain should have taken over this. Why it has not been taken over? Somewhere we have either wrongly interpreted Lashley, or the Lashley's whole experiment is a bunkum. It is at that time it dawned upon us that Lashley is also true, partially, and these people, Brenda Milner, Hans Stoiber, a neurosurgeon, to name a very few, pioneering work in this regard. Then look here, when the Lashley removed a particular part of the brain, rat has learned it did lose that learning, mind you, but it had no permanent deficit because it took the same number of trials to learn. It is not extra trial it took. What has happened there is, let us say it has learned by the visual cortex now. That Lashley has removed it has used the other sensory signals to learn. By seeing, it used to navigate the maze. Now by hearing the sound that was coming there while moving, that also you have removed. Then the smell, that also you have removed. Yes, Lashley is right. Mass action, equipotentiality is not there. There is discretely related. Brain is discretely related to mental function. Now, Lashley, when they removed the whole brain, loss is there because all the sensory representations of the brain, you have removed it. So Lashley's interpretation was wrong, although his observation was well taken. This is another catch we have fallen into for the next 30 years. The catch that it is discretely related to brain. It is true for cognitive functions, I agree with you. But when you come to, we did on that initially, with the psychological test, cognitive functions, accurately pinpoint where the damage is there. Even today it is done, and subsequently Velmans has evolved a wonderful battery, which is globally sensitive, applied to anybody, any kind of mental conditions. Yes, cognitive functions, yes. But when you come to the personality, and that is the topic of 3-day conference, self, well, I have dabbled with that after cognitive science. I failed it miserably. My students have left me because they can't make head or tail of it. Very simple reason. How do you take the global measure of consciousness? If you take, let's say, heart rate, there are people who are lung reactors. Any stress that comes, the lung, if you put the machine, you would have known. Heart is very peace, calm, like a saint. That doesn't mean that he's not reacting. He is a lung reactor, a brain reactor maybe, or a heart reactor maybe. So you have to take all the measures of the whole body to relate to mind. Although now that the imaging technique has gone, when I was doing in the 70s and the 80s, there was no imaging technique. So it was very difficult to take the whole body as such. That is where, the Claridge and others, they come out, Venables and others have come out with the concept of a total bodily arousal. The whole body contributes to a state of an arousal, and that is the base for the mind to act upon. Lower the arousal, lower the capacity of the mind. Higher the arousal, better is the capacity, but beyond a particular point. Curvilinear, inverted U curve. Further increase in the arousal of the body, further decrease in performance. Both low arousal and high arousal decrease in performance. The high arousal end is the schizophrenia, etc., mental illness. Low arousal end, Beatles and hippies, and which trigger them the creativity. The optimum is the one that is in there. And that explains the method of tranquilizer, the effect of tranquilizer also. They are already in the high end of the arousal. Tranquilizer brought them to the optimum level. Those who are at the lower end, music, dance, etc., they created excitation, come to the optimum level. But even then, arousal is as a concept. Even if you take it into autonomic stereotypy, it is called a lung reactor or a heart reactor, a total quantity of the arousal that exists could be related to the mind. That was they toyed upon. But even there, it was not looking within. That's what I wanted to say, taking one more minute. It's all looking out. Eastern approach, especially Upanishads, is a classic example of how to look within. Bhumi rapo nalo vayu, kam mano buddhi revacha. These are all matter. That is 5 elements. Intellect, mind, and space. All the 8 are matter. This is Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. Taking from Upanishad. Look, whole West is thinking mind as spirit. Look at our ideology. These are all matter. From this we will never get the self. Although self is there in all this, but in a dormant form. You can unveil it only by understanding. That's the reason why we should understand self going within, because you can enliven yourself, cure your mental illness, reaching your true self. But that can never be reached. Unknown can never be reached by the known method. Take it or leave it. It has to be going beyond these 8 that I mentioned to you now. Upanishad is very eloquent on this. Eto vacha manasa, aprapya manasa saha. This cannot be approached even by, in fact, the words and the mind written baffled by the first sense of self that it experiences, because it cannot comprehend that. Eto vacho manasa aprapya manasa saha. Then, at another context, it says, Nayamatma pravachanena labhyo na medaya na bahuna shrutena. This pure self cannot be got by instruction, by your intellectual power, and also by But I just mentioned by hearing, number of hearing. No, it cannot be reached at all. And all the method that we are talking now in understanding self is using all these things. And how we should go beyond the mind. And that's what the phenomenology is trying to do that. But all Western phenomenology, including the greatest of them, Heidegger, stopped at this level of going beyond that because it's really shocking. Because you go with the mind to understand phenomenology, forget it. Dissolve that mind. Have courage to dissolve that mind. Because mind itself cannot capture that. It is beyond words. But there is a method. The Rishis have perfected that method. When you silence these things, all the 8, there's a methodology to silence these things. It expresses itself by revelation, not by linear logical thing. Mathematics could approximate it, but even and many have done that. But a true creativity emerges when you give up even that also. So going beyond this is going within. If you use the same sensory and other methodology, like mind, cogitation, you cannot approximate that, not even approximate, let alone reach that. So this is the point. Going within, according to me, means being that self. Brahmavid, Brahmaiva Bhavati. To know Brahman is a classic statement from Upanishad. To know Brahman is to be Brahman. Knowledge is that separate entity from which you observe the reality and acquired knowledge. Stupid. It can never be that. You be that. Get it beyond the mind. The moment you silence that, you are taken there. You don't have to do that. And that is merges to everything that exists there. That's what Velmans experienced that and reported also. By looking into the white crane moving in the sky, he went into a rapture, connected. I can't live even without a second. A tree is required, fed me oxygen. Tree cannot survive without a second without me. I have to give it carbon dioxide. So everything that exists is connected. And that connectedness you can enjoy, experience, and grow, provided what prevents that connection? The mind, the sensory channels. If you silence that, you are enriched so fully. And that itself, whole your body gets enriched. And how do I say that? When we are stuck with these methodology of cognitive science as well as finding out the self through arousal methodology, I really thought of going from within to find out the body, because within controls the body. We said at the beginning of a therapy, Rogerian therapy was followed at that time. Any therapy you could do that. A patient is supposed to be in a constrictive self. Put all your physiological measures on him now. What is the reflection of constrictive self in the body? So you are coming from within, not throw the body, understand the self. See, what is the body? Is there any change at all? And as the therapy advances, as the last day of the therapy, again put all this. In between also you are going, monitor continuously. Thanks to imaging technique, it is possible now. Even remotely we can do that also. At the end of it, what would be the process? A very free flow in the heart and the lungs and the liver. And lactate content would be more, Mahesh Yogi says. Is it true? All that is a thing going from within to understand the world around, because the within has created this world. That I'm sure the physicists also will agree. That empty space that we call is pregnant with creative possibilities. So from within we can go there by this. And that's where my student said, I can't. I can't do this at all. She gave up. I had to find a new topic and a new guide. And then finally she is in States now, nothing to do with psychology perhaps, got shocked so much about this, she is doing business there. Why I am telling this, by that time I also got into other things. This is perhaps looking within. Take a person, an evolved person, what it takes to evolve, silence all these things that you are talking about. When he evolved that, it reflects on the matter. On these 8 things that I told you, it reflects on that. It is not beyond that, it is one and the same actually. So when it reflects on that, just know that. Don't do anything about that. What you can do has already you have attained that. To be one with everything that exists, and from that evolve yourself along with others, all beings others. This is, I think, is looking within. I think that should not really the brain that are there, the very eminent brain. I see Boy there and many others here, would perhaps try to go from within to understand what is outside. Thank you.